Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Recovering Reality podcast. I have my friend with us today, Dr. Lisa Stanton. How are you today, Lisa?
I'm good, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Lisa, let me give you guys just a little bio on her. She's been in school for a little bit longer than I have. That's for sure. Are you still studying anything currently?
No, I finished my PhD in 2019. So I've been done for 5 years or so.
That's awesome. So, Dr. Lisa Stanton holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Minnesota, specializing in behavior change theory. You completed a National Cancer Institute post-doctoral fellowship in behavioral cancer prevention at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine, later working in health tech on AI coaching for type 2 diabetes. However, your weekly essays, videos, and book 52 life-changing lessons I learned in recovery, focus on personal experiences rather than psychology. She says she shares her journey of overcoming addiction, eating disorders, anxiety, ADHD, and more, emphasizing how she shifted from relying on scientific knowledge to finding true healing through faith in God. Did we get all that right there?
Oh, that sounded right.
All that sounded right. That's quite a bit. I know a tiny bit. We've chatted before. I know a tiny bit, but I'm excited to hear a bit of your story and dive into some questions as well. Before we do though, how are you? How are you doing? You're in Minnesota currently?
Yeah, I'm in Minnesota. I get to tell everyone in case you can see my background. I'm in
Yes.
Minnesota. I'm going to Panama tomorrow on a family vacation, and I started packing and didn't realize it was going to be in the background when I sat down. So you can judge what I packed for my trip back there.
So your room not typically that dirty? Is
Not
that what you're?
typically having clothes everywhere.
That's good.
Although there
Minnesota.
was a time going back to addiction, there was certainly a time where there was clothes and food and drinks everywhere in my room. So,
Oh gosh, I can think of a couple of different living situations I was in years ago that they weren't cleanly, that's for sure.
no.
No, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and certainly
True.
not the physical environment, any of the above at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
No. Minnesota's even north of me in Ohio. It's got to be freezing cold there. It's cold here right now.
It is. Let's just see.
It's snowing
Um,
outside here. It's probably like 25 here. Not this. I just
oh,
moved here from Florida 7 months
it's
ago.
7. I woke up
7.
at -9, so that's actually warmed up throughout the day.
That's warmed up. But you are heading to Panama, correct?
Yeah, where it's 90 or something. So,
Oh, that will be a wonderful change.
yeah.
A wonderful change. Well, let's dive in. I think it's important to get some of people's story because it kind of helps us get a grid for where someone has come from and what they've overcome. And one of the things I tell people all the time when it comes to coming out of addiction into recovery is none of our stories are identical, but they're all very similar.
Mhm.
Very similar if we pay attention. And I tell people look for the similarities in the stories, and it helps us relate more and stay encouraged. So let's dive in, if you don't mind, and maybe just tell us a little bit about what got you to the point where addiction kind of had its hooks in you.
Yeah. I'm going to start actually with like childhood, where being born, because I feel like that I was born, there's no alcoholics in my family. Like my mom's not an alcoholic, my dad's not an alcoholic. Everyone's got their own little control issues and neuroses, which I never thought of as related to addiction until I got into recovery. But it's not like I grew up right in an alcoholic home or in an addicted home. When you were talking about like look at the similarities, not the differences. Like when I first got into recovery, or like people started pointing me in that direction, I was like, I can't be an alcoholic. Like I don't come from an alcohol. I don't even. It's not in my family. How could I
I'm
be
the
one?
same. There was no drugs or alcohol, violence at all in my home when I was young. None.
Yeah. So I'm born to, my mom has her PhD from Princeton, so a long line of overeducated folk. My dad just has a master's degree, but we love him in the
Just
family anyway. No, I'm kidding. But so like upper middle class, my mom was a professor, my dad like worked in PR and did various things. And then when I was about 5 years old, they got divorced. And if you asked me, basically anytime before I got in recovery, how did that go? I would have been like, it was amicable, right? Like there are these explosive, violent divorces, and then you're like, oh, that's how she became an alcoholic. And it's like, this was not an explosive, violent divorce. This was, they barely even use their lawyers. Like you have to get a lawyer to literally get divorced. But other than that, very calm. But what I've come to realize is just the confusion of not knowing why that was happening. The confusion of then my dad starts dating someone, like now I have a stepmom, now I have a stepdad, there's new kids being added, then kids get adopted. That there's just like a lot of confusion, and I didn't know to ask questions, and I just started internalizing a lot of that and actually getting pretty angry about a lot of that. Um, Without even really realizing it. And that anger ended up manifesting in like I had anxiety when I was little, and I had this thing called separation anxiety disorder where I like got freaked out when I went to my dad's house. I thought my mom was going to die every time. So like neuroses were coming out early. I actually had a sticker phobia also, like terrified of stickers. Um,
How did a forgive me for interrupting you? How did a sticker phobia come about? I'm intrigued.
I have no idea. I just woke up one day and like it's like a classic phobia, like where people are like terrified of spiders to the point where they can't even
Mhm.
look at them. Like if there was those orange paid thank you stickers on the milk, I was like having my cereal with water that week, like just terrified of stickers. And the way that I understand it now is just like when you have all this stuff suppressed, it like it has to find some way out. And like a lot of times control and fear and whatever is what's coming out. And it was coming out in these odd ways very early before I ever found the release of all of that in drugs and alcohol, which is, of course, what's coming in 90 seconds or so.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll say this real quick. It's interesting. It's in some ways where kids don't even realize that, like you're describing, at such a young age, this trauma becomes evident
mhm.
in their life. I experienced it. Not my parents didn't get divorced, but we moved, and I moved
Mm,
from California to Utah. And for some kids, I guess it's not that bad. Maybe some it is, but just the whole change in environment for me started doing similar things. I don't think moving is maybe the same as experiencing a divorce. I wouldn't
kind of.
suggest that, but I would say it similar things. It just these underlining just discontent, bothered,
Mhm.
questions as to why, but not even knowing I was bothered. So not even asking the question, but
Yeah.
living in this kind of internal chaos. And then it's strange. You don't have anyone to talk to, but if you did, you wouldn't even really know what to talk about other than saying, like, why'd we move?
Yeah.
But you can't identify the emotions and whatnot. And so I can relate to a lot of that because a lot of that bubbled up inside of me, inside of different circumstances.
And what's interesting too about what you said, is I only learned in recovery, from a mentor of mine that confusion leads to anger. And the example that was given to me was like, think of the last time that you lost your car keys. You start out confused. You're just like, oh, where are my car keys? I can't find them anywhere. And within like 3 minutes, you're like, where are my freaking car keys? Who stole them? Like, what's going on? And the same thing happens with circumstances. So whether it's you're moving or my parents getting divorced, it's not that like doing that made me angry, but doing that made me confused. And over time, that confusion just sort of like snowballs into anger because I don't know why that's how humans seem to work.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. I got angry. I started getting in fights at like 12, 13 years old. Not even violence had never even been modeled in my life.
Yeah.
Never. There was no violence in my home. And I started getting in like fights at school and I was just bothered all the time. Makes perfect sense in my story.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, so they get divorced. There's a lot of confusion that gets added. I will say like trauma, quote unquote, wise, I'm careful of using that word. It's just a word that everyone uses, but I actually call it just like confusion. And I'm going to put a big label on some confusion that comes up. But right around that time, too, there was a girl that my dad and stepmom were trying to adopt, and her birth mom died of cancer. And then my stepdad's ex-wife, like, which my mom and stepdad were like then getting married. They'd been divorced a while, but just like this other adult woman mother that I knew, she also passed away, like in a short period of time. And then also in that same year, a friend of mine from school, his mom murdered him and then committed suicide. Obviously, like a ton of
Wow.
mental illness there. So there was like a bunch of death right in a row when I was in fifth grade, which is the thing I was labeling trauma. But really, like, I guess to give it because trauma is so broad, it's like, well, how do I even heal from that? it was so confusing to me. And then I got so much more angry without even realizing it. And that
Yeah.
kind of snowballs into like, that was fifth grade. And by seventh grade, summer after seventh grade, summer after eighth grade, I can never like remember exactly when, but either way, within a couple of years of that, I had my first drink and like most of the other neuroses just like disappeared. Like I had found this thing where like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I was still pretty anxious when I wasn't drinking, but like pretty quickly snowballed into drinking a little bit. And then in high school, it was basically whenever I could, but it was hard to find because you had to like buy it from older people and we would buy it in these like Deer Park water bottles and cul-de-sacs. But basically
You're, oh, that's hilarious to me. Older kids would deal alcohol in water bottles. That's
Deer
hilarious.
Park, it was $20 for a Deer Park water bottle full of vodka in like whatever that was 20 years ago.
They had
So
a
it was like a
racket
pretty
going on.
expensive
Oh yeah, man, they were killing
situation.
it.
Who had this guy, his name's Ian, I like still remember, but Ian made a killing on
Oh,
selling
I
alcohol to
bet he
minors.
did. I bet he did. And it was probably the cheapest vodka
Oh
possible as
yeah,
well.
horrible,
eight
horrible.
dollars a bottle or something like that.
Yeah,
You know,
truly.
you mentioned you're. I'm sure you're about to dive into this, but you mentioned, and we're going to get into more of this in a second as well. But you know, when there's that, and I think the way you differentiated it, confusion and trauma. I think trauma. I like the way you put that. I think trauma is thrown around a lot, and trauma typically that's for some pretty intense things that someone has been through. But confusion, I like the way that's put. And you get someone that came from a home where there was no drinking, there was no alcohol, there's no violence, there's no anything, and they're just filled with that confusion and anger. All of a sudden, a drink or a drug, and like you said, problems just kind of drifted away. All of a sudden, you think everything's okay in life, and unknowingly, just not having any idea what you've gotten yourself into.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that's basically the story. And then to not have it take forever, like the next however many years, so through all of high school and all of college, I feel like my story sort of remains the same in that I have this, I'm living this like dual life of I was so insecure that other people's approval, especially in the form of excelling in academics and athletics, was extremely important to me. And then I would like get overwhelmed and always drink too much whenever I drank. So it was like this weird thing where I was getting basically all A's. Like I literally got one B plus in ninth grade from Miss Quinn, and I know who it is, right? Because I was that
Still
still
got her
got it.
name, Miss Quinn.
European civilization. I don't even remember what happened, but I was mad about that too. But like this devil life of like, I need all this approval. I had 14 varsity letters and there's only 12 seasons because they let me do track and soccer at the same time. Like super achiever, but then like blacked out all the time. Like I'm always in trouble. My friends are bringing my limp body home to my parents' house and being like, "Oh, sorry."
You were
My
a
parents were like,
blackout
"Why do you
drinker.
black out?" Yeah, blackout drinking from the start. The first time I drank 12 ounces of whiskey because I didn't understand the difference between beer and whiskey. That's its whole own story, but threw up everywhere. I weighed like 80 pounds, but enough stayed that I like got
That's a rough
extremely,
introduction there. 12
it was
shots at
a
first. Yeah.
rough introduction. Chugged it like out of a water bottle on the way to a party. So yeah, it was a mess. But what's interesting is like I can't really remember a time where like I wasn't blackout drinking. Like in high school,
Me
I would
too.
kind of contain it like there were times we were drinking. I had a group of friends where like some other people were doing this too, but like we were drinking whiskey in the bathroom at school, but like only Friday afternoons when all that was left was clubs, right? So I needed to make sure that I wasn't going to screw up my classes, but then drinking literally as much as possible otherwise. So always that dichotomy. I went to college and kind of a similar thing. I went actually to run Division 1 track and cross country because I also had an eating disorder and I was compulsively exercising, but it got me a track scholarship.
Some
Um,
good came out of it.
something good came out of it. College for free.
Yeah.
So I went to college again. It's like Division 1 athlete. She's getting all A's. She's going to the school. And then like within a pretty short period of time, basically was like my leg broke. And then I was like, track's not for me. And I joined a sorority. But then still like I kept, so the sports thing was gone, but I kept like, I think my GPA in college was like 3.9, 3.8, 3.9. I can't even remember, but like really high. Um, And then also my nickname in college was Lisa Pizza, and everyone knew that I blacked out all the time. But I was like scholarship chair of my sorority and got like every single scholarship award. Like most semesters I had a 4.0, I got a B one time. That's what like brought it down because I forgot to write a paper because I was drinking. Um, but like mostly I was getting all A's all the time. But then also like when I would win those awards, people would be like, how are you even winning those? Like you're blacked out every time I see you. So again, this like that's when people are like, how are you in addiction, but you were getting a PhD at the same time? And I'm like, I literally was like, the ism itself, like the dis-ease that I think of alcoholism, was
Mhm.
both making me so obsessed with achieving, so people thought I was okay, and obsessed with relief from the world. So it was like those two things just ran in parallel for like most of my 20s. So like it was like that in high school, it's like that in college. Then I moved to Minnesota to start this prestigious PhD program. University of Minnesota at the time was ranked like fourth in the country for a PhD in psychology. So I moved here to do that. That's why I moved to Minnesota of all places. Like I got into Duke first, but like University of Minnesota was better. So I was like, all right, I love high ranking things. So that's where I'm going. And the
Let me
same,
ask you,
yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead,
yeah.
go ahead, go ahead and finish what your train of thought.
I was just going to say that same thing happened in grad school to basically bring us through 7 more years as I was drinking whenever I could. I started dating a guy who owned a bunch of cannabis farms. So like drugs and Northern California, LSD, mushrooms, like that became a big part of my story in my 20s. But like I would do LSD for a whole weekend, but I would like write 20 pages of a paper on Monday.
That's wild. There's not that many people who are there's I know plenty of people who are high achieving while they were in addiction for sure, or could maintain it for long period or periods of time at least, but it would
Yeah.
never sustain. But there was this thing in you of this fear of what people thought and multiple other things that drove you. Do you feel like any of that was driving you was, if I just keep excelling at these other things, then I can keep drinking and partying as much as I want and nobody's going to say a word about it, because why would they? Look at all these other things I'm achieving over here.
Yeah. I think a little bit. I mean, people were saying things about it.
Well, if you're always blacked out, LSD
Um,
all weekend, it's hard to hide.
Yeah, I'm like, there was a number of like friendship and boyfriend interventions over time, ultimatums from boyfriends, even ultimatums from friends, like throughout that whole time. So it's not as though, I guess what's weird is it's not as though I was like holding it all together. So like nobody in my life knew. It was just this weird thing where I was like doing just enough that like I could keep moving forward. But then everyone around me was sort of, I feel like I almost got this weird like ego boost out of like being the girl who was blacked out all the time, but also like doing all of these important things.
But the end of the day, how long is this sustainable? You sustained it longer than a lot of people.
Yeah, it all falls
But how
apart
long is
in about 2 years after that. I mean, it was really starting to fall apart. 2019 was, I finished my PhD in 2019. Um, and that spring, I was like really devolving into alcoholism, like drinking every day, trying to get my work done. It was like really kind of falling apart. And then like met a guy, and men are another category of things that I really had to recover from, like how I interacted with the opposite sex. I met a guy, and he like was like really put together, was starting his own businesses, whatever, kind of like we met. He thought I was so smart, whatever. And then within a few dates, he was like, why do you drink like this? Like, what is going on? And I was like, I don't know. I have to finish my PhD. And he basically like babysat me. Like we dated that whole summer and I didn't drink, I think, for 44 days. But he like, I basically like lived in his house and he babysat me while I finished my PhD. Like if I hadn't met him, I don't even think I would have finished it. So it's really weird to look at how like, I mean, I'm sure it was God before I even like, I didn't think God existed at that time, but like moving through these little situations where like basically by 2019 I had completely fallen apart, but there was some other people who were like holding me together enough to keep me moving.
Yeah, I can say that a bunch of different times. Looking back at my story, the only way I made it through was God. God loved me long before I loved him. Over
Yeah.
30 of my friends died before I even started my recovery. I was just as bad or worse than any of them. I
Yeah.
don't have a reason why I wasn't. I just try and capitalize that now
Yeah.
I'm still alive.
Yeah. I don't think I had a single, I mean, I had friends who died in car accidents and kind of like random stuff, but I wasn't, that's what's weird too about, I mean, I shouldn't say weird about my story, but what, like, if you're listening and you're like, well, I'm not an alcoholic because all my friends aren't using the way that I am. I was always like, nobody else was doing this. I have like, I guess I have one other friend who's sober who looking back, I was like, oh yeah, I can see you too. But I wasn't like surrounding myself with people who were like blacking out and doing drugs at the level I was doing them. It's just like I was doing that.
That's why I love hearing people's stories because they're just never the same.
Yeah.
Just nobody's story is the same. People go through the wildest things, but when I was, high school, coming out of high school, there was just the pill heroin explosion where I was
Mhm.
in Utah, and it was the pills that were just taking people out left and right.
Yeah.
Mhm. So, what did the bottom look like, and what did that beginning of that shift begin to look like for you?
Yeah. So the bottom, I would say, started like that summer where I realized like I'm barely holding this together. This man is what's holding my life together at the moment. Ironically, once again, on the outside, I finished my PhD. I get this prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern School of Medicine. So I was working on like projects related to secondary cancer prevention and control. So breast cancer survivors, helping them not basically helping them stay in remission through like stress reduction and behavior change. So like that's my day job. And that's the first time. So during a PhD program, you don't have to show up to work. You write, you sometimes teach some classes, but you don't like check in at 9, check out at 5 type of deal.
Hmm.
This postdoctoral fellowship at the School of Medicine required me to be there from 9 to 5 for the first time in my life. And it became abundantly clear to me that I was not capable of doing that. I was too hungover. I couldn't I had to get up, get on a train and like get to my office at 9 and it was not happening the way that I was drinking. So that starts to evolve. And people at Northwestern, I think, are starting to notice, like, because I would make it, but now I'm hungover in person for the first time. Or when I was just writing hungover at home in grad school, nobody can tell you're hungover when you email them something. Um, so that was really falling apart. And then February of 2020 happened. So I moved to Chicago in 2019. I'm falling apart. Now suddenly I don't have to go to work anymore because COVID has started and we study cancer patients. So like there's no point in going, they can't come in. I can't, there's no point in me coming in. So my job became fully remote all of a sudden. Right as I'm realizing that I can't have an in-person job. But that luckily brought me to a point where like something just kind of clicked or like the opposite of clicked in that moment, where as soon as I didn't have to go to work anymore, I was drunk 24 hours a day for the first time in my life. Like I had been on like multiple day benders, like over weekends, like we were talking about, but I had never like just not been able to get sober. And then that's the first time where like for literally probably the month of March, I didn't ever get sober. I was waking up and drinking and I was going to bed and drinking. I was like trying to go on weird Tinder dates because the men's stuff was like the only way of getting approval. Like it was a mess. But I was basically drunk for like a month and a half.
It's a lot
And
of
woke
drinking.
up. Yeah, it was mostly box wine at that point. Just
Oh, not
yeah,
definitely not the top shelf. I
no.
always joke, I'm like, gosh, I never got that bad with my drinking. I just woke up and did drugs. Totally different.
Right. So I was also prescribed that's like the ADHD thing I talk about. So I did like all the testing and stuff when I was like 21 or so. So I like did officially get diagnosed with ADHD, but then of course they started me on some small dose that I'd pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed over time. So at that point I was on anti-anxiety meds. I was on 54 milligrams of Concerta plus like 2 extra 10 milligrams of Ritalin if I wanted it, and then I was drinking a bunch. So although I didn't have like cocaine in my apartment at that time, I was just doing bajillions of over the counter things that were technically prescribed to me, but like no one needed to be doing any of those things at the level that I was doing them.
Yeah, that's a ticking time bomb right there.
Yeah. So that's
I'm
my life.
thinking there's a bottom coming here pretty
Yeah.
quick with that much substances in your system on a daily basis.
Yeah. So one day I woke up. This is literally the first time where when I look back, I'm like, God did something because I don't get it. I woke up one day and just had this thought. I mean, woke up hungover. I'd peed my own bed, which I used to do literally all the time. Peed my own bed, it's just like, it was on these, it's a mess. And I woke up and my first thought is like, I can't be in Chicago anymore. And I literally packed a bag, got in my car and started driving back toward Minneapolis. And it's not like I got sober that day, but I moved in back in with an ex-boyfriend who was here in Minneapolis, who within a few weeks was like, what is happening? Like, you always drank a lot, whatever, but like, I've never seen this, because I started drinking wine 24 hours a day in his house. And then he basically was like, you need to get help. And so I go off on this 5-day bender. And then Memorial Day Tuesday of that year was when, like, so about like a month after that, so April, May, whatever, I wake up at the end of May and I'm like, I'm done. Like, I have to be done. I need help. And it's just like, once again, I feel like it's a God thing, because that no one was, I mean, the ex-boyfriend was kind of doing that intervention, but no one was like, no one sent me to treatment. No one did anything. I just finally woke up that day and was like, I'm done. And called, his name was Dylan, called him, and was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I just went on this bender, but like, I'm done. Can I just like come stay at your house a couple days while I figure out how to get sober? Cause he basically like kicked me out and been like, you can't do this. And I went home, detox. I just couldn't like move for a couple days.
Yeah.
Detox just like on the couch. I was just like sweating. I was planning on going to a recovery meeting, but I literally physically could not move for a few days. And then that Thursday, I think, was my first. I called a friend and he was like, go to a meeting. And they were all on Zoom at that point. So I went to my first meeting. And then basically from that point forward, I start like the journey of recovery. It took me 7 months to fully stop using. But like, I never blacked out again after that day. I never, like, I slowly but surely I was in this place of like, well, this doesn't count and this doesn't count. And LSD helps me be calmer, and mushrooms helps me like embrace my spirituality. And so that's what the next 7 months was just like working with a recovery mentor and then being like, no. But that day was kind of like the beginning of that journey of, at least I was open. When that feedback started coming, I would fight it a little bit, but like, in the grand scheme of things, I thought 7 months was forever. But now that I've been in recovery, I know that process sometimes takes people much longer than 7 months to really be open to that feedback of like, hey, no, like literally actually like stop using all of the substances.
Hey, it's Erik Fredrickson. If you're ready to break free from addiction and mental health struggles, I've got you covered. My best-selling book, Recovering Reality: Freedom from the Torment of Addiction, will give you the blueprint on how to break free and stay free. My free resources will help you take action, and my one-on-one coaching, backed by over 10 years of experience, is where real transformation happens. So head over to www.recoveringreality.com and order your copy of my book and schedule a coaching consultation today. Take that first step towards freedom. All the links are in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Yeah, and it's pretty common. People trip up, fumble around at first, and it takes a little bit of time. It doesn't have to work that way. It doesn't have to, but it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. We talked a little bit before, but there's a common understanding that alcohol and drugs is the problem.
Hmm.
But for people who really, really have that, the hooks in, the bug in them, or whatever terminology we want to use, I learned this. I didn't even learn this early on. It took me a little while. And I heard people start talking about it, but drugs and alcohol was not my problem. It was my
Hmm.
solution. Mhm.
Yeah.
What it, what was it like when you realized that, and kind of break that down from your point of view a little bit?
Yeah. For me, it was actually like that. I embrace that concept. I embraced actually pretty early, I think. Um, because I guess the whole time, like, I knew something was wrong with me, if that makes sense.
I did too. I couldn't have,
Yeah.
explained it to you, but I definitely knew.
Yeah. So I think I embraced it pretty early. Again, it took me a little while to embrace it for all of the substances, that being free from all of them was the only way that I was going to actually understand the real problem. But it resonated so much, because when I saw it as like drugs and alcohol are my problem, the thing that I kept experiencing is when I stopped them, my life didn't like dramatically get better. And kind of like what you were saying, where it's someone where like the hooks are really in them, or like, I don't know if people call it alcoholics anymore because now we're on a spectrum or whatever it is, but
I think there's a lot of labels, if you will, at work.
yeah. So I'm like, whatever it is. But like, if I've gotten to this point where like I've completely lost control of drinking, the thing that I found for me is that like life didn't get better when I stopped drinking. Like, if I just look at the casual drinker who stops drinking and I look at like their Instagram or whatever's happening, they're like, oh my gosh, everything is so much better. I wake up and I feel better and this is better. And when I stopped drinking and using, I was like full of anxiety. I was full of fear. I still didn't know who I was. I still didn't feel comfortable in my skin. I was like a little bit automatically more productive for a couple days, but then it tended to go back in the other direction. And I couldn't figure out why that was until that this idea was presented to me that it's like all of these things, like you have all of these anxieties, all this anger, all this confusion, all this fear, and that what actually soothes that is the drugs and alcohol. Like those are your solution for not having to deal with those. And so the only way to actually get to a place where you can deal with those is to get sober, stop using those. Then all of that is going to bubble up and you're going to see it in full force for the first time. But then you can actually begin to work through it and come to a real solution, which, spoiler alert, since you said at the beginning, like that real solution for me turns out to be God. But like then I can have a real solution where I can get that same relief from the fear and the anxiety and the confusion and the anger, but it doesn't come artificially from outside spirits. It comes from inside spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way that you broke it down. I heard this very simple analogy that I share with my clients still regularly. And addiction recovery is kind of like this. You're just driving around in your car and you open up the letter, the bill that you should pay. And instead of paying it, you just throw it in the back.
Mm,
You eat your food and, the wrappers are all right there. Instead of throwing away, just crumple it up and toss it in the back. Dirty clothes, this, whatever, you just toss it all in the back. And then you stop and you hit the brakes and everything comes flying to the front seat.
mm,
And now all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute. If I just ran away from my problems, they'd go away.
yeah.
And it just doesn't work like that. I can totally relate to that. And I see it in my clients constantly. They early on, and all of a sudden you take away what was their solution. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's even worse. It's even,
Yeah.
they get even worse, even more anxiety, anger, bitterness, these different things. And all of a sudden now they don't have that crutch to lean on, or they can't numb things or escape, and it gets even worse for them.
Yeah, the other thing that got worse for me is I didn't like really harp on it too much, but for me, eating disorders is actually a pretty big part of my like overall life story. Like anorexia, bulimia, some binge eating disorder even. And the other thing that I saw is when I got sober without a spiritual solution, like December of 2020 when I was like trying to get sober, but I didn't surrender to God until basically like end of December, early January. I was literally binging and vomiting 6 times a day because I
Wow.
needed like some way to feel different. And
Mhm.
eating disorders was my like main cross addiction. And so it's just like when I removed that my main solution without another solution, I just fell so much deeper into my personal cross addiction. I know for other people it's whatever, gambling, porn, whatever you're doing. But
Mhm.
like once I had a spiritual solution, then like now I don't vomit and I don't binge drink. But like without that, I was just like ping ponging between anything that would like numb me and make me feel different.
Exactly. Just make me feel different. I don't want to feel this anymore. Now, you mentioned about all these things that start bubbling up in early recovery. We talked a little about this before, but what role does self-centeredness, forgiveness, and resentment play in early sobriety recovery, but also just in recovery period?
Yeah. For me, I did not realize the extent of my self-centeredness before I came in. I like
Me
my
either.
I don't even think I thought that I was that self-centered, truly, which is nuts when I look at it from the perspective that I look at it now. But I think I remember just my eyes being open to all of I thought self-centered people were sort of like this extremely confident, prideful person is how I viewed self-centered people. And I did not understand that like me not taking other people's feelings into account was self-centered. Me thinking about what other people are thinking about me is self-centered. me being lost in self-pity is self-centered. Me being lost in despair is self-centered. When I'm in this fetal position in my bed, I have never been more self-centered. I'm completely consumed by thoughts of self. And I just like it didn't even occur to me before I came into recovery that in order to have the level of anxiety that I had to be completely self-absorbed. It was just like really not on my radar. And then for me, like basically that self-centeredness is also the root of a lot of the resentment. Once again, that I didn't even realize I had. Like I would say self-centeredness and resentment were the two main things that I needed to recover from truly. And resentment in so many different forms, I think is what's so interesting. That it wasn't just like, oh, I resent my parents for getting divorced, which I did actually resent my parents for getting divorced at a much deeper level than I had realized. But all these really subtle resentments, like I resented like that my dad was super athletic because it made me feel like I had to be skinny, which doesn't even, he never even said that. It doesn't even make
Yeah.
sense. But it's like getting to the root of all of these resentments is what really kind of like blew the door open on all of this. And then for me, the forgiveness piece is, of course, like people who harmed me, I need to forgive them. But like kind of the interaction of all those three things. So if I think about something where like forgiveness, resentment, and self-centeredness came together, this is a kind of tough one, but most women who drank too much like ended up sexually assaulted in some way or another, right? And before I came into recovery, it was men are horrible. I can't believe that a man did this to me. I resent him. I'm allowed to resent him. And then when I started to like really peel that apart in recovery, I got to look at how my own self-centeredness like cause, and I'm not saying this for like every, don't apply this to yourself if you were just like randomly walking down the street and something happened to you. But for me, it was like I was literally going out on purpose, flirting with men, trying to attract men, like doing all these things. So like my self-centeredness, my need for approval from men that I was doing subconsciously on purpose put me in these situations that then I put myself in a position to be hurt and then I resent them and I'm unforgiving of them, which is only causing me to be even more poisoned by my own behaviors. And so it's so cool to see like the many places of forgiveness of like, yes, I get to like go to God and ask for help to forgive these men. And then I do. And there's freedom in that. But then going to God and being like, I need forgiveness for the resentment that I had against them. I need forgiveness for the way that I was showing up, seeking all of these outside approval instead of just God's approval. And that the gift of that is then I get to forgive all these people. I get God's grace and forgiveness. And then I get to like have a change of heart where I now show up in a way where I'm like, I can't even imagine a situation where that happens to me now because my behavior is so different that I can't even like I'm never in a position where I'm getting even close to that.
Yeah. There was a lot of things you touched on there that were good, but it's interesting what you ended on there. It's like, yeah, it's fascinating how little trouble you get in when you don't just like blackout drink and put yourself in these insane situations all the time or
Yeah.
create the insane situation. But that resentment forgiveness thing is so big. And the way I break it down, like with people I'm talking, like some of it is case by case. This is one thing, like, somebody cuts you off on the freeway and you're pissed off. Okay, it's like,
Mhm.
all right, like get over yourself, forgive them, and go about your day.
Yeah.
But then there's also some case by case stuff where it's like people have been through some stuff. I'm sure you've talked with
Mhm.
some people. Sounds like maybe you've been through some things. I've been through some things, and I've heard some just horrific stories. But it's like that forgiveness is, there's that famous quote from Nelson Mandela, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. It
Mhm.
really is. Spiritually speaking, it's cancerous.
Yeah.
Eat you alive. The AA Big Book was resentment's the number one offender.
Number one
It's the
offender.
number one reason that drives people back out there is because, like, spiritually speaking, you just open up this door for the enemy, darkness, addiction, put which words you want on it, to just come in and torment you, basically, and just
Mhm.
poke at you and bother you. And forgiveness is really about getting that poison out of me. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean you're saying what the person did is okay. It doesn't mean, again, some of this is case by case, depending on what happened, but it's like, it doesn't mean that person, you have to give them full access back into your life. It doesn't
Right.
mean that. It just means you can't hold on to that. It'll eat you alive.
Yeah.
The
The one
anxiety.
thing that I feel like has been really important in like forgiveness for me is mentors telling me that it's not like just do your best to like pray for help forgiving and don't try to predict the outcome, right? Because sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to forgive because I don't want to let this person back in my life, or I don't want to forgive and I know I'm going to let this person back in my life, or like, I don't, do you know what I mean? To not predict, because the other thing is like sometimes, like, there's a time where I can remember this mentor where I'm like, well, I'm like, I don't want to forgive because like then I'm going to have to let them back. And she's like, here's the thing, just don't predict that, because I don't want to sit here and say, like, please forgive them. It doesn't mean that they're ever going to be back in your life, because she's like, I want God to lead that, right? Like, I don't want you to even pre-decide before you do the prayer how this is going to go. Just
Yeah.
like know that you're going to let go of it and that then it's up to God. And God is not going to lead you back into a place that's going to like implode your life again, right? Like, you're probably never going to speak to the ex-boyfriend again that you're forgiving. You're just going to forgive them. If it's your mom, like maybe, maybe not. It just depends. But like to not try to predict that myself.
Yeah, that's good. And praying for them, you mentioned, it's one of the simple things that I tell people constantly is you'd be shocked. Anyone, let's say you're listening, you have a resentment towards someone, and you're just like, I can't forgive that person. I've worked with some people, some absolutely horrendous things have been done to them. Their own parents trying to kill them. And
Mhm.
one's coming to mind. And it's like, where do you even start? You know,
Yeah.
and I tell people this is extremely simple, but it is in the doing it you get the freedom. Begin to pray for that person for 5 minutes a day, the way you would want someone to pray for you. Pray for
Yeah.
them that their life would be blessed, their health, freedom. Just pray for them the way you would want someone to pray for you. At first, it's going to feel like you're fighting it. Like, I don't want to pray for this person. Give me a break. Pray they have a good life. Don't you know what they did? But you fight through that and you pray. After 5 days, a week, you'll be shocked. The
Yeah.
sting comes out of it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The my favorite prayer that I use it, I mean, like I use it literally every day for resentment, but I do because if someone does something stupid on the highway, I just pray this prayer right away to clear the slate. But it's like, God help me grant, like if I was mad at you, God help me grant Eric the same tolerance, pity, and patience I cheerfully grant a sick friend. How can I help him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done. And it's not like I'm trying to get an answer for how can I help them, but it's just kind of that like that thing that you're talking about, where it's a prayer asking God to help save me from my own anger and kind of this little like blessing to them at the same time.
Mhm. That's good. Simple, but
Yeah.
it works. That's good. So let me ask you that you've mentioned how, you didn't believe in God. There was some atheism that was happening, and then somewhere along the line, God came in.
Mm-hmm.
So what made you switch from atheism to Christianity? What happened, and when did you fully embrace this new way of thinking after being on the opposite path with your heels
Yeah.
dug in for so long?
Yeah. So I'm gonna say my whole 20s, I was basically atheist. My growing up was like kind of my dad took us to church a little bit, but then both families are actually Jewish. So in my very early 20s, I went like on birthright to Israel and then was going to like Jewish young people's events, but I wasn't really doing the religious part of it anyway. But basically didn't believe God existed, one way or the other. I thought it was cute that the people who led the Jewish events did think God existed, but I definitely was not interested in it
You
personally.
thought it was cute.
Yeah, I was like, oh, look at that. They like think there's a fairy. But that's sort of like how I thought of God, is like it's cute that some people pray to a fairy. And then I got into recovery and everyone kept being like, you need a higher power, you need a higher power. And I was like, I don't think I do. You guys are nuts. Like, I know a lot about behavior change psychology. I know a lot about like I literally don't think I do. Let me just like do the principles underlying these, right? I don't need this whole thing. And then eventually I kind of opened up to like, okay, I'll like call it the universe, but it was a very like new age thing that I had going. And And I have been exposed a little bit to new age stuff before because that ex-boyfriend who owned cannabis farms was really into like astrology and like all the crystal. He was like putting crystals out in the moonlight, like very much like into that. So I had like experienced it some with him, but I still kind of thought he was it like I was more atheist than that for most of my 20s. I was like, oh, that's nice that he like thinks all of this is true, but I don't really know. So I defaulted to that at first. Um, and I wasn't really getting any better. I would like think I was getting better and think that things in my life were improving, and then it would just kind of fall apart again. So I think this sort of like basically an internal rock bottom, is
That
what
was
brought
mine too.
yeah, just like I wasn't drinking anymore. I was using fewer and fewer drugs. Um, and I can't even really explain it, but I just knew like in a weird way, I knew that I was fighting something. Like I knew I was fighting a surrender, but I wasn't really sure why. And basically December of 2020, I went to a new meeting, which was on Christmas morning, which is
Oh, what a coincidental day for that to
I
happen.
know. So Christmas morning, 2020, I walk into this meeting that had been like recommended to me a bunch of times, but it's at 6:30 in the morning in North Minneapolis. It's kind of like the every city has like an area that's like, I don't know, like I'm an upper middle class white person, right? So they're like, don't go there, it's not safe. So that's this area of Minneapolis. It's now my home group. So, and I've never felt unsafe there, but this meeting is in that area of town at 6:30 in the morning. And I was like, I don't wake up at 6:30. I don't go to North Minneapolis. Like, I'm not going to this meeting. But it happened basically Christmas Eve of 2020. I had like an overnight panic attack because I was super in. That's like when I was throwing up all the time and panicking, and I wasn't even using drugs anymore again because they was my solution. So now I'm just left with my own anxiety. And then so I was just awake at 6 a.m. on Christmas morning. So I went to this new meeting and they just were like, God, 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 God. Like more so, a lot of times recovery meetings are a little bit like, oh, my higher power. And this one was just all in. Um, and everyone was just so happy and so welcoming. And they invited me to their breakfast after Christmas morning breakfast. And I went to this breakfast. And then there was like one particular guy, his sobriety date was also Christmas morning. So he had given like the little speech thing. Um, that he was just so happy and like joyful and funny. And I was like, can you tell me like what's your secret? Like, how are you not miserable? Like, what's going on? Um, and he was like, I'll show you tomorrow. Like, hop in the truck. So after I went to the meeting the next morning, and then we like drive in his truck, and he drives me to a church. Like that's the meaning of this. We pull up outside St. Mark's Catholic Church, which is not even a church that he goes to. That man is not my husband, by the way. So not even a church that he goes to. And he's like, that like we're gonna go in. And I'm like, what the hell is this? We were going to a daily mass, like a Catholic daily mass is what I walked into. And for whatever reason, like that's kind of the beginning of my journey of like things just slowly started hitting me. And it's hard to explain. There's a bunch of like different things that happen, but within a couple of days of that, I got on my knees like in a Christian church, was like, okay, man, if you're real, like let's go. And the day, January 4th is the day that I did that. And January 4th is my sobriety date. And I always say, like, I did not know the day that I got on my knees and surrendered my life to Jesus, that that was going to be my sobriety date, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't have a white flash of lightning and I was like, I'm never going to use drugs again. It's all over. It was just like slowly but surely, like my spiritual experience, my like conversion to Christianity, whatever you call it, coming to believe was not a white light experience. It's just that slowly but surely, one day at a time, I never had to use again after that day. And I started to experience God's grace. I would say the moment where I finally like knew God was real was like when I was praying like that, what you were talking about, when I was praying for like help forgiving people. And the first time where I really experienced just like release from hatred towards someone. And it was like while I was praying, I couldn't deny what just happened. And I had written like a whole list of people and I was doing the whole thing. And I looked down and I was like, I don't hate him anymore.
Yeah.
How is that even possible? And I would say like that I didn't even know the word God's grace at that moment, but like that's what I referred that it turns out that's called God's grace. And that was a moment where I was like, okay, this is real, and I'm like willing to go all in on whatever this means.
Gosh, we could talk for another hour about so much of that, but it's certainly not coincidence that the day you surrendered Jesus and invited him in, you've never had the need to use again.
Yeah.
It left. Yeah, I can remember so many times early on in my journey, I didn't so much struggle with the God thing. I had some pretty wild encounters when I was young. But if you wanted me to define it, if you wanted me to give you some theology, I just would have said, like, I don't know. I had no idea. I mean, it was God, kind of Jesus, but I didn't really have any. I couldn't tell any Bible verses or anything. I just was around it when I was young.
Yeah.
But early on in recovery, I experienced just the more I would focus on spending time with God, the more, a porn addiction stuck around. And the more when I just really got serious about my relationship, it just kind of left. Cigarette
Hmm.
addiction just kind of left. This bitterness, anger, these things, they just dissolved from my life and they've
Yeah.
never come back.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's just crazy what a difference it makes. And I think even today, right? It's now been more than 4 years. And I still like I think it's so crazy that I'm a person that believes in Jesus. Like there's still a little part of my brain that I think is like embarrassed, like a little bit. I don't know how to explain it, but I think because I was like I had so many preconceived notions about Christians that I think there's like some little piece of me that still needs to be like, I am 100% sure Jesus saved me the whole thing. And I still am like embarrassed that that was the answer in some ways, if that makes sense. Because I can't, like, I literally thought the stupidest people on planet Earth were Christians. They were just people who like didn't ever read a book. They gave up. They don't understand anything. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I even think
Get here.
that?
Yeah. I tell people, like, read the gospels. He didn't pick the perfect people. He
Yeah.
picked some pretty messed up people. And when he came into their life, it transformed their life.
Yeah, in ways that I could never imagine in ways. And I got pretty deep into, like, I glossed over it, but pretty deep. I didn't just like dabble in the new age. Like, I had crystals. I tried to take a psychic mediumship did take a psychic mediumship course. I was a like 200-hour certified yoga teacher. I really tried the like spiritual but not God path. Like pretty aggressively, and it did not produce anything close to what the surrendering to God path did.
Heard a lot of people talk about that. I spent a couple of years in San Diego doing ministry to the New Age community, and they were always some of the funnest people to talk to.
Yeah,
But I've heard many people talk about that. Then when they surrendered to Jesus is when they finally found what they were looking for.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Well, as we're winding down here, I got one more question for you that I think is really important. But so what does it look like living a surrendered life of faith right now, and how does it impact your day to day and major decisions?
yeah. So I was thinking about this question in terms of like, what does it actually look like? Because I have worked with people, um, or just watch people in recovery, watch myself sometimes when I'm not like on my game of I can believe in God, but not actually be like living a life of faith. And then I'm not going to have any of the gifts that are promised to me in the Bible, because I'm not actually like living with God. And I have just sort of like the goofiest story of surrender over the long term, recently that started. So I got sober in 2021. Um, at the time was working for this like diabetes tech company. And then in 2023, got laid off, was praying about it, right? Like my husband's like, pray about it. My sobriety mentor, pray about it, right? Like that's why having like good mentors in sobriety in your life are so
Yes.
important. My husband's also in sobriety, but he should not be my main mentor to anyone who is in that same position.
I think it's a good point to make. Yes.
Yeah. So my husband is a great sounding board. Also have a separate mentor or mentors. Like talk to them and they're like, pray about it. Like, let's talk through, like, first of all, only in like people surrender to God when you lose your job are people like, that is so exciting. I'm so happy for you. I can't wait to see what God has for you next. And I'm like, yeah, this is exciting, right? Surrendered. So lose that job. And then I was getting married that August. So I got married August 2023, and my fiance, now husband, was like, why don't you just like wait till after the wedding and then figure it out? And then during that time, right, letting go of like, this is what my finances need to look like. This is what, like, I hadn't really had to contend with a lot of that, like the promises of financial security and all these different things. Cause like I had a good job that I kept when I got sober. And so surrendered to that. And over the last, like during that time, that's when like the Instagram started and I started writing about sobriety. And that's how we end up meeting is people followed the Instagram and I ended up getting a book deal during that time. And so over the last, been basically 2 years, I've been like, okay, this is where God is calling me. Like I'm going to help people in recovery. I'm not sure if it's as an author or an influencer or like exactly what's going on, but I think this is what I'm going to do full time. But like I pray every day, morning and night, always like, what is God's will? And over Christmas was on LinkedIn because my publisher was like, you need to be posting on LinkedIn. And I was like, how do I write about God on LinkedIn? So I'm on LinkedIn because I'm trying to find like pastors or ministers, like anyone who's showing up on LinkedIn in a not weird way, and talking about God. And up pops this job that looks a lot like the job that I had in 2023. And I was like, oh, that's funny. I used to love my job. Like, it's not for me anymore. And it just wouldn't get out of my head. Like, it just was stuck in there. And I was like, praying about it. And I was like, I think I'm supposed to apply to this job. I don't even know why. So I redo my resume, write a cover letter that's more honest than any cover letter I've ever written. It's like, I lost my job. I thought I was going on this track. I think maybe I'm supposed to go back to research. I didn't write God in it, just because I don't know, it's a cover letter, but like I didn't say like I've been wanting a job like this for years. I was like, I don't even know what's going on. And long story short, over the last like month or so, there was 6 rounds of interviews for this job. It's a clinical research scientist, like it's a pretty technical role, just like the one I used to have. And I kept praying, and I'm like, is this like really where you're calling me right now? And ended up getting a job offer like a week and a half ago from it. Talked to my
Wow.
husband, talked to my mentor, prayed about it. And literally this crazy thing happened too, where I was in a thrift store and there was a like piece of equipment from this company in that thrift store, and the company is in California. So it doesn't even make sense that it would be in a thrift store in Minnesota. And I was like, I think like I'm supposed to go back to research and I don't know why, but that is a life surrendered to God. Is so I ended up accepting the job offer. So February 24th, I start a full-time job again as a clinical research scientist. And if you ask me like, what is God's plan for you? Why? I'm like, I literally don't know. What I do know is that I'm positive that I'm supposed to take this job and I have no idea. Like I was talking to a friend, I'm like, maybe like the medical director needs a conversion and I'm the one who's supposed to do it. Like,
Oh,
I
I'm sure there's
don't
more than
know.
one reason. Yeah.
Yeah. So I am starting, it's another like health tech diabetes coaching company that I'm starting at in a couple weeks. So that's like to me surrender, because it's not just surrendering to like what makes sense and what's better. And the way that I used to make decisions would have been like, well, what's better financially and what's better this and what's better that and what's better like all of these things. And it was just like, I don't even know if it's better for me, but I know that God's calling me. So I don't have to write a pro con list and decide if it's better for me. I just know I'm supposed to be doing it.
Sounds like trust.
I
You
hope it
trust.
works
You
out.
trust that he's good,
Yeah.
that he's leading you into something good. It's part of the adventure. It really is, and one of the things that I've learned about following Jesus is we've got to trust that he's good.
Hmm.
How are you going to take a job where you're like, this makes no sense unless
Yeah.
there's some trust that he's leading you there?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then it makes it exciting because I'm
Oh
like,
yeah.
what is this mission that you
What in the
have put
world are
me?
we doing now, God?
Yeah. And it's okay because I mean, it's the Instagram is now in a place where like I know how to post a couple times a week and have a full-time job at the same time. Will I post every day like I did the last couple of years? Probably not, but like that's fine also. Um, so and like the book's already out, so it's sort of doing its own thing. And will I have like fewer, I don't know, like probably like speeches, or I'm not going to be able to like travel to talk about it, but I fully trust that that is what God wants, and there's some reason why that's not the way that this is supposed to happen. And it's like so fun because I don't have anxiety about how it's all going to work out because I know that this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
It is an adventure.
Yeah.
It certainly is an adventure. And well, I never get tired of hearing people's stories. I just don't, because again, none of them are the same, but there's so many
Yeah.
similarities, and how God shows up in the details. I don't get tired of hearing that. He
Yeah.
just finds ways to bring us to our knees to where we accept Him, and then life gets better.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It gets better. And the other thing I'll say, because I feel like this is so important too, is like it gets better, and it gets better in the ways where it's not getting better, if that makes any sense. Like it's not like it was always easy to not have a stable income for the last 2 years. Like that was hard. And having a job is going to be hard in a different way. And like my husband is he was married for like a very short period of time in 2016, 2017, and now is in a crazy divorce custody battle. Like it's bad. And the way that she shows up, I get to pray resentment prayers all the time about. Um,
Practice.
yeah, is the best way to frame that without like whatever making a thing of it. But it's like it's horrible. Like he's in supervised visits because she's dishonest, and that supervised like the person who supervises, who has been supervising for 30 years, is like, I've never seen a case this bad.
Wow.
So it's bad, but it's like because of God, we like get to pray for her, right? We get to pray for her. We get to pray for all the lawyers involved. We get to let go of all the money that it costs to be involved in this. We get to like the spiritual growth that has come through that suffering is like so cool. So I don't want someone to be like, oh, well, if I get sober and surrender to God, my custody battle will end, right? It's like that, those
Maybe
don't,
not.
yeah, maybe not. Maybe it will
Mhm.
though. I've seen that happen a lot too.
Sure.
But even if it doesn't, like the peace that I get to have even during the storm is I think what's so cool.
Yeah. There's a verse coming to mind in Philippians that talks about the peace that surpasses understanding.
Yeah.
There's just moments where it doesn't make sense. I shouldn't have peace right now.
Yeah.
And I do.
Yeah.
I was not capable of that before I started walking with Jesus.
I was
That was
not
not going to happen.
either. I honestly probably like would be in jail for assault at this point if I didn't have a relationship with Jesus.
I went to jail multiple times for different reasons before I knew him for sure. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on, being open, sharing the story. I know it's going to help a lot of people. I appreciate you sharing your story.
Thanks. It was fun to be here.
So, you talked about your Instagram. Forgive me, it's like 50,000 people or something like that, or
I
following
think
you on Instagram.
49.
49,000 people. Didn't see that coming, did you?
I did not see that coming. Although it's been actually a gift. So at one point it was 52. And it's
Mhm.
actually kind of nice to like let go of followers too, to like let go of like it's such a way that God works things. You're like, oh wow, look, it's growing. And you're like, oh wait, it's shrinking. Because people follow you from like one video that was fun, and then they realize how much you're talking about God, and then they unfollow you, I think is what
Yeah.
happens. But either way, it's like there's a lesson in people showing up, there's a lesson in people leaving. There's just lessons in everything.
Learning to just be comfortable in who you are no matter what. Mhm.
Hmm.
So if they want to follow you on Instagram, if someone wanted to reach out, book title, we'll put all these links in there. But how can people connect with you and talk about the book title real quick?
Yeah. So the easiest way is Dr. like Dr. Lisa Stanton.com. And then you can like link to Instagram, you can find the book, you can find this podcast will be listed. Like there's a link where I've just all the podcasts I've been on. So that hub is the easiest way. And then on Instagram, I'm Dr. Lisa Stanton. I have a Substack. Those are probably the main places, but the website is the easiest place because everything's just connected there. And then I think I have a copy of the book here. The book looks like this. It's called 52 Life-Changing Lessons I Learned in Recovery.
One a week?
one a week. The first one is the longest. I always warn people. It's basically a mini version of my story, which you just heard. It's like a 20-page version. Lesson 1 is stories can heal. This is mine. And then there's 51 other lessons. There's a few that are like strictly recovery related, but a lot of them are just spiritual lessons that I've learned over the last few years.
That's awesome. Grab the book, guys. Link will be in the captions. And again, thank you so much for taking us on a little journey with you.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us on another episode here on the Recovery and Reality Podcast. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you got value from this, do me a quick favor. If you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're listening on the podcast, leave us a 5-star rating and a quick review. It helps us reach more people with this message. And if this episode helped you, share it with a friend who needs to hear it. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time.